of American history, the Roaring Twenties. This period ultimately changed and set up today's image of modern America. The 20s, aside from Leonardo DiCaprio and The Great Gatsby, were a time of great economic growth, major cultural change, rampant rebellion, and yes, many parties. The Roaring Twenties set up a culture that would forever change the course of American history. During the 20s, a new American culture was on the rise, the culture of mass consumerism and materialism. Consumer credit was relatively new, and many people were fascinated with the idea of purchasing materials without actually having hard money. This immediately became the new stigma of buy goods and trends. With the introduction of consumer credit also came the start of consumeristic culture that shaped the culture of America today. The consumer credit in detail, this idea of no real money but still had money, sparked an idea of spending more than you could afford. With more and more people spending more than they had, many people were falling into debt. And this debt became the norm during the 20s and up to this day. More spending also meant more mass production and overproduction, gross domestic product, and more industrial innovation, all of which were key components to the Roaring Twenties.
Thanks, Haley. Furthermore, on the change into mass consumerism are the main causes. What led to these changes and how we perceive consumerism is directly related to this time period. For example, patriotism also developed this type of mass consumerism. With the defeat of Germany and the victory of World War I, this basically led to much patriotic love for the country. The idea that we were literally the most powerful country in the world led to the idea of this greed or the desire to fulfill yourself. Wow, much want. This caused a turning point in American history because we no longer focused on imperialism, isolationism, colonialism, expansionism, Americanism, new nationism, expansionism, etceterism, Blavinism, yada yada yada. This was the idea in which we were satisfied in where we were in the world, and we just decided to live a comfortable life that focused on more of I want instead of I need. Another huge cause was that during a wartime production economy, this was in World War I. Many businesses, farmers, and other industrial powerhouses were encouraged to overproduce needed supplies and goods for the war. This eventually led to an overproduction of goods after the war, and therefore prices went down, stimulating the economy. What also stimulated the economy was that at this time, labor unions were still a radical force in the U.S. economy. Many businesses had their hands full with these unions and found very manipulative ways to dissolve them. For example, high-paying jobs and many benefits were given into those sworn oath to have no interaction with organized labor. This led to an increase in wages, obviously, approximately about $5 an hour to more like $8 an hour for Henry Ford. Ooh. So when you have a lot of money with cheap goods at the dollar store, you get this idea of mass consumerism, which contributed to the turning point of Roaring Twenties and would change the way modern America works. We could also go into how overproduction became an issue. A huge event that happened in this time was that the mass production of innovative goods became very effective. Take, for example, Henry Ford at this time with his innovation of the assembly line and the Model T car. This ultimately what made the car or automobile extremely popular and led to the increase of both supply and demand for the car. The airplane and radio, both invented in 1908, also made its mass debut in the 20s, as radios were used for popular communication in politics and social issues, as well as airplanes when they were mass-produced for wartime. After the war, they became used for commercial industrial use. In short, innovation was a huge contribution to the Roaring Twenties because it stimulated the economy with the idea of what Haley said earlier, spending more than you can handle. All of these were huge contributions to the idea of mass consumerism, which eventually led to the economy and influence of modern-day America.
Cool story, bro, Daniel. Now looking at the cultural shift during this time, the Roaring Twenties set up the platform in which modern American society is characterized today. For example, our buddies in Congress ultimately set up the attitude and image for modern women today with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Prior to the 1920s, women were best characterized as lesser to their male counterparts, being restricted, targeting discrimination, having little mobility in economic, social, and political advancement, and resembled traditional roles and norms as reflected upon the ideals of the Victorian values. However, ever since 1848 at the Convention of Seneca Falls organized by women's rights activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the fight for women's suffrage was achieved at a political and national level. As a result of this 70-year fight for women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920, granting the right to vote for women. Although discrimination of mobility and job opportunities were still an issue for women during this period, the 19th Amendment was a great step forward for equality between women and men, political advancement, and women's rights. As a turning point, the 19th Amendment allowed the departure of the typical traditional image of women to today's image of an American woman, one who obtains freedom of personal choice and equality in society. Another cultural shift and creation of the modern image of women were the results from the flappers from the Roaring Twenties. Now when I talk about flappers, I don't mean those flippers that scuba divers wear, or a young bird trying to fly, or whatever. I mean the birth of unique style, Western style women that reflected upon the New Age liberalism during the Roaring Twenties. These ladies represented the loosening of ideals during this time by the type of clothing that were worn, use of heavy amounts of makeup, showing hairstyles that resemble their male counterparts, drinking, smoking, driving automobiles, or really any scornful action against social norms and ideals. The birth of these New Age women were from the shackles and the political turbulence during the 1920s. For example, as a result of the temperance movement, the prohibition movement shut down many of your favorite local bars and saloons. As a result of popular contempt against the prohibition movement, there was a rise in flappers and attendance of flappers at the back alley speakeasies, resulting as a major factor for the large appearance of these ladies. Now, why do we care about these women who dress very loosely, disobeying authority in any way, and creating a rebellious, radical lifestyle for teenage women? Well, as a result of the flappers challenging traditional Victorian roles in this today male-dominant society, flappers created a turning point for the image of the American woman, which ultimately set up the modern image of the American woman today, which can be reflected as looser, liberal ideals represented through today's fashion styles, freedom of personal choice as a woman in career, and larger social and political mobility and equality to men. Looking upon a different light, the Roaring Twenties proved to be a turning point for not only women in America, but African Americans. For example, the climax of the Harlem Renaissance was a cultural shift for African Americans. This movement was the great expression of arts, music, dance, and theater by African Americans. As a result, during this period, African Americans were using these artistic talents and intellectual abilities to challenge racial stereotypes and foster black pride to accomplish later modern-day racial integration amongst white Americans. Alongside with the climax of the Harlem Renaissance, the Roaring Twenties was a crucial point for the birth of jazz music.
Now you must acquire a taste for freeform jazz.
Like the Harlem Renaissance and flappers, jazz music was a turning point in the culture as it reflected upon the departure of conservative ideals prior to the 1920s and emphasizing the expression as an individual through music. In addition, jazz was a great departure from classical European music prior to 1922, America's first original genre of music that reflected the loosening of morals. Also, with the appearance of jazz music and Harlem Renaissance ideals, this was a shift in which African American ideals and culture was truly integrating among American cultures, creating the modern day culture today.
The Roaring Twenties became the start of a new beginning for American culture as people became more consumeristic with the rise of credit and seemingly omnipresent advertisement and propaganda. As more and more people began to purchase items out of want instead of need, the American industry grew enormously as Americans became increasingly obsessed with this new technology and machines, such as the car, a crucial necessity in today's society. But this blissful era of spending without using hard money would soon cost the United States in one of the greatest depressions in history. The Roaring Twenties culture was truly a turning point in American history as the era set up the modern American culture of materialism and normal debt. This time was a time of great shifts in the ideals for women also as they began to flaunt more provocative clothing and began to take on looser morals. But this rebellion was not only in the women but throughout all of America as the people actively rebelled against prohibition with the various underground bars and speakeasies. Overall, the 20s truly did set up a culture that would lead American culture to what it is today with a shift of various areas of society such as a new morals for women, a changing view on the African Americans, with the onset of the Harlem Renaissance, and man's increasing dependence on machines and technology. All of these aspects of the 20s ultimately carved the road for modern American culture.